Hey, thanks for checking out this inaugural video for Quest Forum's YouTube channel. I'm always seeking new ways to connect and just to give people ways to, get involved with the content that I'm trying to create. And so I figured the YouTube channel was the next natural step in that, and give people a way to see and hear me as well as just reading what I write down. But obviously, there's going to be a lot of growing pains in this. I'm kind of nervous about it, but yeah, I've been a YouTube watcher for a long time, and I've seen some of my favorite content creators as they've grown up and just how they've gotten better, and I realized you have to start somewhere, so I figured I might as well start here and see how it goes. And as far as this video itself, it's kind of a weird place to start just because I'm, doing a video to finish a concept that I started with a number of articles already that were in a series, which I don't even do that much. So maybe it's a little bit odd to not just do something totally different, but I figured no time like the present, I'm up for it, might as well get it done. So this article and the video that goes with it, they're an extension of the series that I did on assisted suicide over the past 2 weeks here, the past couple of articles. And so this goes along with that concept and what I was talking about in those articles, but it's also more widely applicable than that, and there's kind of a bigger impact that the idea I'm looking at here has had on society, which is the other reason why I thought I could treat it separately. But what happened was that I was talking to someone about the assisted suicide series that I was doing, and just kind of my basic premise, which was that, and I know it sounds harsh, but suicide is always a selfish choice. It's something that you ultimately do for yourself in spite of the impact that it has on others, and of course, from my perspective, the impact that it has on God, the way that it's breaking in on His sovereignty over our lives. And so it's always wrong, it's always selfish. That was my point in brief as I was explaining it to this person, and they said that they agreed that they had no problem with seeing suicide as something that's wrong to do and that it is always a selfish choice. But they said something that put me off my guard, something I was a bit confused by initially. They said that suicide is also always very courageous. And I didn't know what to think of that in the moment, and had to kind of mull it over for a while afterward until I finally realized what it was that I found off-putting about that idea. And I finally pieced it together, and so I thought I'd share that here, because it's just about the way that words are used. Suicide, I will admit, it definitely is a fearless choice, but that's different than being a courageous choice. It's fearless because we naturally fear death, and it's possible through a number of ways to overcome that fear, which is a good thing, in order to accept death. But that's not the same as overcoming that fear to the point of choosing death, embracing death, and leaping into it. And that's a fine line distinction, but concepts like that matter. Being devoid of fear is not the same as having fear and deciding to choose a good thing instead of it. And so fearlessness, unlike courage, can be foolish. I think the easiest example of that is just the idea you can play chicken with a freight train. That doesn't make that courageous. It's actually stupid. It's unreasonable to do that. But it's also certainly fearless. And so that's the distinction that I have in mind here. And I'm drawing it from what I remember learning about Aristotle. That was the thing that kind of helped me put this back into the proper perspective. What he taught, and I'm not saying that Aristotle's gospel truth, I just think it's a useful way for understanding this concept. And he taught that when you're on the scale between vice and virtue, that there's basically three factors. And it starts with your emotional reaction to something that happens to you. And so in this case, we're talking about fear. And then natural capacities that everyone shares. Everyone has the capacity for confidence. What you then throw in along with those two things is your characteristics, what you have trained yourself to be, and how it is that you respond to the emotional reaction of fear. And that will be where you wind up as either in virtue or in vice. Now, what he taught about the scale as you go from virtue to vice is we would kind of naturally think of it as being virtue on one end and vice on the other, but that's not what he explained. What Aristotle believed was that vices, there were two vices for every virtue, and that they were on the extremes, and then virtue was the mean between them. And so we'll use confidence, again, as that example with what we're talking about here with assisted suicide. And on the one extreme is the obvious one that we all think of in regards to courage would be cowardice. To face some type of fear and then not react to it all, to run away from it rather than striving forward in order to work past it. But there is an extreme on the other end, which I think maybe the best word to describe that is being brash. It's a form of recklessness, and that's the one that's ignored when it comes to suicide and a lot of other things, where people aren't really considering the full cost. Some things are fearful enough that you should not work through them, that you should avoid them. Now, reasonable courage, that's in the middle of the scale. That's the mean. That's where you have something that you are afraid of, something that it's reasonable to be afraid of, but that you also decide that overcoming that fear is ultimately the best end that you can achieve. And that's where I can see some people would see suicide as courageous, but that's because they have a misunderstanding of what the end of it is. And that boils down again to recklessness. It's not reckoning with the outcome. It's not counting the cost. And that's what always happens with suicide, because with suicide, the cost is always greater than the reward. It's always wrong because it has the wrong ideas on the value of life. And I discuss a lot of that in those previous articles, and I'll leave links in the description so you can go see those. But like I said, this has wider application. This has to do with more than just assisted suicide. It has to do with a lot of vices, because society is embracing a number of vices. People's individual choices are kind of being raised to the highest level, to the point where they are always described as virtuous, whether they're actually right or wrong. And we're losing some important distinctions. So there's this classical definition that crime is harm that you do to others, vice is harm that you do to yourself, and sin is harm that you do to God. And we're basically losing those last two. People's concepts of vice and sin are being wiped away. And there's a lot of people, of course, in secular culture who believe that there is no God, so of course they're not going to accept the idea that you can do anything wrong to him. But as a result of that, when you don't have anyone who's overall that we're all accountable to and who's defined the difference between good and evil for us, then it becomes much more difficult to see how you could hurt yourself too. It basically means that you are God and that you can decide what is good or bad for you and then pursue it, whatever the consequences are. And of course, when you reach a state like that, then you can't be very far away from losing the last definition also. The idea of crime, the idea of harming someone else, that's going to get wiped out too, because you're just going to see other people as playthings, and they just exist to serve your interests and whatever it is that you desire. And we're seeing that, and it's something that you also do see in Scripture, where you have that humanity at its lowest point before the flood. And it's said of humankind that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. That's Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. And that's, to bring that up, I know, is talking about judgment. It's talking about the end of the world. I'm not saying that we are there. I have no idea when that's going to be. I'm just saying that I think it is possible to see, as this philosophy is taking over, where your every choice is right, whatever it is that you want, that shows you how people can get to that point where they are nothing but evil all the time. And so for those of us who do still recognize these distinctions and who do care about the difference between vice and virtue, between good and wrong, we can't allow virtue to be cheapened. There's a lot of people in the world who are celebrating self-destruction. And they don't consider it self-destruction, but that's the end that it leads to. That's what vice is. And we can't go with them. We have to be able to point out the damage that's being done, and we have to encourage people to seek change, to seek actual betterment, to understand the consequences, to count the cost. And that's the nature of salvation. People need to know that they need it. They have to. The only reason you're going to come looking for salvation is if you know you have something to be saved from. People aren't going to seek Christ unless they can see first that their every choice is not good. And God willing, I do believe we can turn that around. I believe it is possible to open people's eyes to this reality. We just have to know the truths ourselves. We have to know the truths that God's put in His Word, and also that He's written into our nature. And if we do that, then we can point out the difference. And I think courage actually ends up being a good place to start, because that's what it's going to require. But again, I thank you for checking out this video. I hope you come back to see more, and that you'll be willing to put up with the technological issues that are going to be involved in this as well. Obviously, I have a lot of limitations as I get started, but again, you have to start somewhere. So thanks, and I will see you again.